I think, paying more attention to what's happening beyond the cliches, beyond the idea that it's, just this site of extraction, this site of violence, is something that we all need to be doing, right? Because Congo is a hugely important country. It is not just caught up in the past. It is very much a part of our future. In some ways, it is the cutting edge. And I think that if we want to understand anything that's happening at the global level, right, especially when we're talking about technology or the evolution of humanitarian norms, so on and so forth, we can only do that by paying attention to what's happening in Congo.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today's guest is Zachariah Mampilly, a scholar of insurgent politics and African social movements. Mampilly brings years of research and field experience to our discussion on the origins and ongoing consequences of the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We explore its links to the Rwandan genocide, the resurgence of M23, and the geopolitical stakes in the region today. Please enjoy our conversation. To introduce our audience to the topic, could you briefly explain how the 1994 Rwandan genocide set the stage for the conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo today?
Sure. So the genocide in Rwanda is usually sort of limited to events that took place in the summer of 1994 and within the territorial boundaries of the state that we call Rwanda. But as we know, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what actually took place. First, the end of the war was really precipitated by the entry of the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Forces, from Uganda, which is where they had been based prior to coming back into Rwanda. So the conflict was always regional in scope. And then more importantly, and relevant to the question that you just asked, after they had routed the Hutu militias, the genocidaires, in the Rwandan conflict, many of them fled across the border into neighboring Congo. And they were moved into these large refugee camps and settled in some of the surrounding villages, where they were hoping to continue engaging in various forms of political activism. And what this triggered was an invasion by the RPF after the genocide had occurred. And so the RPF entered into eastern Congo, by the late 1994, where they proceeded to attack quite a few of these Hutu ex-militias. But also to kill many others who were just sort of caught up in the violence. And estimates put the number killed around 50,000. So it was quite a significant act of violence that unfolded in Eastern Congo and that was largely erased from the historical record about the Rwandan genocide for reasons I'm sure we'll get into.
What role did the First Congo War, which took place between 1996 and 1997, play in shaping the political landscape of the region? And how did it influence the rise of groups like M23?
So, as I just mentioned, the Rwandans were present in Eastern Congo after the Rwandan genocide in 1994, and they were quite unhappy with the political security situation in Eastern Congo that they encountered. And so there was a number of different groups that had been operational in Eastern Congo at that period, but it kind of created this moment where these sort of dissidents against the Mobutu government were able to draw on support from both the Rwandan state as well as the Ugandan state in order to launch a new kind of invasion of Eastern Congo from Rwanda and Uganda. So in 1996, you have the start of the first Congolese war. That gets resolved fairly quickly. By 1998, you have another bout of fighting that begins. And in the 1998 fighting was even more directly shaped by the intervention of the Ugandans and Rwandan troops. Basically, they had invested a lot of money in the first invasion in 1996. And when Kabila, who was the leader, Laurent Kabila, who was the leader of that army, came to power, he cut off ties with the Rwandan and Ugandan states. So in 1998, they followed up with another invasion, again from the east, with a different set of rebels, who once again plunged Congo into a war that is continuing into the current day.
From here, we can transition to a discussion about the genesis of M23 as a group. Its predecessors, including key figures like Laurent Nkunda, but how did its objectives evolve over time? I'm interested about any potential elements of nationalism or ethnonationalism that would have been prevalent in the shaping of M23.
So in 1998, when the Second Congo War began, there was a group that was at the forefront of it called the RCD, or the Rally for Congolese Democracy. And this was a group that was put together, by a combination of the Tanzanians, the Ugandans, the Rwandans, who wanted to create a more permanent solution to the perceived chaos that had unfolded in Congo following the 1996 invasion. And so they gathered together a wide variety of different figures, including some prominent business people from Eastern Congo, militia leaders, as well as some intellectuals, some academics who were based outside of Congo, basically exiles who had fled the Mobutu regime. And so from its beginning, the RCD was very much an umbrella force, bringing together these different ethnic communities, but also different social categories. So academics, business people, former military folks, into this very fractious coalition that soon after they entered Eastern Congo in 1998, broke apart into multiple competing forces. And so, by the fall of 1998, you had different factions of the RCD. You also had the emergence of other groups like the MLC, the Movement for Congolese Liberation, that started to emerge and take territory across Eastern Congo, and also including in other provinces within Congo as well. The RCD war, continued really until around 2003, when there was an attempt to create a peace agreement and a ceasefire that led to elections. By this point, the RCD was intensely unpopular in Eastern Congo. All of the factions, none of them were particularly successful at generating popular support. And they basically collapsed after their incorporation into the elections that happened in the early 2000s in Eastern Congo. But those elections didn't really resolve the longstanding crises in the eastern part of the country. And so you had a number of groups that emerged to kind of pick up the mantle from the RCD. Just to jump ahead a little bit, the most prominent of these was a group called the CNDP. That was led by a very charismatic figure named Laurent Nkunda, who had been within the RCD and who drew many of the former elements of the RCD into his ranks. Nkunda himself was viewed largely as a figure who championed the interests of the Congolese Tutsi, a population of several hundred thousand who had a very contentious relationship to the government in Kinshasa. And he was able to achieve a considerable amount of success, at least in terms of taking some territories in Eastern Congo in the late 2000s, as well as recruiting people from outside of the Rwandaphone community. So he had some success with not only the Congolese Hutu, but also non-Rwandaphone populations as well. Nkunda was eventually, put under imprisonment by the Rwandan government. He was viewed as a potential challenger to President Kagame in Rwanda. And when following his arrest, the CNDP basically collapsed, and only to be reborn again in the M23 movement, which emerges in the early 2010s. And in contrast to the CNDP, really sort of more narrowly focused on mobilizing the Congolese Tutsi to its ranks. So you see this kind of steady progression from the RCD to the CNDP to the M23, and within each iteration, the group is becoming more narrow, more sort of explicitly championing the interests of the Congolese Tutsi community, and more closely tied to the interests of the Rwandan state as well, which has kind of come to the fore with the most recent fighting.
Is it an accurate view, as many media outlets take on, to see M23 as purely a Rwandan proxy in the region, or does it maintain this independent objectives and grievances, or even with some people who may or may not be prevalent, taking on this idea of a long-term vision of a greater Rwanda?
Yeah, so I think the way we should understand it is that M23 is certainly somewhat independent from the Rwandan state. Like I mentioned, and I think it's important to keep this historical context in mind. There have been long-standing grievances amongst the Congolese Rwandophone population. Rwandophone just means people who speak the Kinyarwanda language. Um, and they have mounted several different challenges. They were a key faction within the RCD. They were the leaders of the CNDP, even though it drew many other groups to the side of Nkunda. And the M23 movement is simply just the latest iteration of this long-standing issue with the Congolese Tutsi population in particular. So I don't think it's quite fair to view them solely through the Rwandan lens or to treat them simply as a proxy of the Rwandan state. Certainly, Rwanda's involvement with the M23 movement is extensive, but I think it's important to recognize that the Congolese Tutsi population is not a united population. It is divided along a number of different dimensions. Some Congolese Tutsi identify very strongly with the Congolese state. They've even changed their names at various points to reflect their connection to Congo over Rwanda. For example, the Banyamulenge population, which renamed themselves after the Mulenge Hills in Congo. And so you see that there are these longstanding grievances, many of them quite justified. It's not difficult to find deep resentment against the Congolese Tutsi in Eastern Congo. The leaders of the Congolese Tutsi have been targeted with political assassinations. They face widespread discrimination and xenophobia. And there are certainly elements within the community who think that the involvement of the Rwandans or the connection of the Congolese Tutsi to the Rwandan state has been counterproductive to the interests of the Congolese Tutsi population generally. That being said, I think M23, unlike the RCD and the CNDP, has had to rely much more directly on Rwandan support. We have credible evidence from the United Nations suggesting that up to 4,000 Rwandan troops are actually operating within Congo, and that marks a pretty substantial departure from their more covert support for the RCD and the CNDP. There are all kinds of claims being made about other types of direct support that the Rwandan state has provided to the M23. So I think, even as it is a reflection of these sort of longstanding grievances amongst the Congolese Tutsi in Eastern Congo, it is certainly of a different type when we compare them to their historical predecessors and much more reliant on the Rwandan state for support.
M23 previously captured Goma in 2012-2013 before being forced into exile. How does its current resurgence compare to that earlier episode in terms of strategy, governance, and external backing?
So I think 2012 was a very important moment for the movement. To set the scene a little bit, Goma is not any ordinary city within Eastern Congo. It is, the commercial capital of North Kivu province. It is the site of numerous non-governmental organizations and international agencies, including, the United Nations Mission for the Stabilization of Congo, MONUSCO, which is not based in Goma, but is based nearby. And there are actually MONUSCO bases in Goma itself. So when 2012 happened, it was genuinely a surprise. I knew people who were living in Goma at the time. And even as M23 had been involved in some of the peripheral regions around the city, the idea that they could capture Goma itself was almost beyond the pale. It just struck them as deeply unlikely, precisely because you had a pretty substantial presence of both the Congolese National Army as well as the MONUSCO force, which is the largest peacekeeping mission in the world. And so for them to get sort of pushed out so quickly was a genuine surprise. And I think it was even a surprise for the M23 militants themselves. I think they expected there to be much more resistance in Goma, and they were, ill prepared for what to do with Goma once they were able to take control of it. And I think that explains why their control of Goma was relatively short. They only held on to the city for a few weeks before again being pushed out into the more remote regions of North Kivu province. If you look at the more recent incursions into Congo, it clearly demonstrates that the M23 movement had a much more coherent plan for what they were hoping to accomplish. Again, the fact that they took Goma was hugely significant. But what we have seen is that they haven't stopped in Goma. That they had, decent relationships with people in the town of Goma itself, so there wasn't widespread fighting once they took control of the city. They have targeted a number of opposition figures in the city itself and basically neutralized them. And most importantly, they have continued their march. And so not only did they take Goma, they also went south and took over Bukavu. They have, made claims that they will now try to capture Kisangani, which is quite a bit further away. All of the cities that we're discussing, Goma and Bukavu in particular, are really right across the border from Rwanda and Uganda, and so are relatively short distances for an invading force from Rwanda to cover. With the latest stories coming out of Congo, it seems that these incursions are much deeper than I think what anybody could have expected. And of course, nobody even expected them to take over Goma and Bukavu in the first place. So this is, I think, qualitatively different than what happened in 2012. They have held on to these territories now for a few months. It appears that their intention is to hold on to them for the indefinite future. And it certainly does invoke, what you mentioned as the sort of greater Rwanda conspiracy. This has been a long-standing accusation. It's part of the reason that the Tutsi community in Eastern Congo has been viewed with suspicion by other Congolese ethnic communities. And that is this idea that, the Rwandan state only captures a portion of the larger Rwandophone population, right? So if you go back to the 19th century, prior to the Berlin Conference, the pre-colonial Rwandan kingdom had reached its sort of pinnacle. And in that moment, under a very sort of expansionist kingdom, they had taken over, large chunks of what we would consider now to be the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And so there are some figures within the Rwandan Tutsi elite who have always championed this idea of reconstituting Greater Rwanda by incorporating into Rwanda or annexing parts of Eastern Congo so that they can be incorporated into Rwanda. And I think it's important to recognize that officially speaking, the Rwandan state has never mentioned this objective as driving their actions in Eastern Congo, which they instead couch as being about security and humanitarian concerns.
Who ultimately holds responsibility for protecting the Congolese people in this region? But before that, given the failures of MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission that you mentioned, to stabilize the region over decades, as I've seen in your work, do you think there needs to be a fundamental reevaluation of United Nations peacekeeping strategies in the DRC or even abroad?
So I think it's important here to kind of go back historically and try to understand how the Congo was held together under various regimes. And if you go back to the colonial period, what we call the Congo is really this vast territory in the heart of Africa. It's roughly the size of Western Europe, so it's a huge, massive territory. It has never really been a united cultural sphere. Eastern Congo, the region where much of this conflict is taking place, was far more incorporated into Eastern Africa generally than it was, say, to the Atlantic side, where Kinshasa is. And in between these two kind of poles, which are over 1,000 miles apart, is the vast Congolese forest, right, which has historically been a pretty stark divider of the country between its eastern and western halves. So, the only way that Congo has been held together historically, going back to the period of Belgian colonialism there, has been through brute force. and some sort of political wheeling and dealing. That's what the Belgians were able to do, and that's what the Mobutu Sese Seko regime, which came to power in the mid 1960s, relied on to hold the country together all the way till 1996, when they were overthrown during the First Congolese War. If we look at what has happened since then, the government in Kinshasa has never been able to exercise effective control since 1996 over the eastern part of the country. This is certainly related to the general dysfunction of the Congolese National Army, but it is also a failure of the United Nations stabilizing mission in Eastern Congo, which has been active in Eastern Congo since the late 1990s, which has always been largest and most expensive UN peacekeeping mission in history. And it has always had, I think, a kind of confused mandate over what they're trying to accomplish that has prevented it from playing a productive role in stitching the country back together. As far as who should be doing this, I genuinely think, and I would agree with especially the younger Congolese and Congolese activists, that it is the responsibility of the government of Congo to exercise sovereignty over Congolese territory. Congolese have a rightful suspicion of international actors. I don't go too far back in the history, but going back to the 1960s, the United Nations has been heavily involved in the politics of Congo, often not on the right side of things, as it were. Certainly from the Congolese perspective, it has been perceived as meddling that has led to multiple political crises in the country. And so, you see a lot of young people in Congo in particular who don't have a lot of faith that the international community is a good actor, that it is capable of resolving these longstanding crises, and have called very directly for the UN mission to leave Congo and for the Congolese state to finally exercise its duties as the sovereign ruler of those territories.
I think I would like you to go into more history about this because this is so interesting. Not necessarily the history of failures by the United Nations peacekeeping efforts, but more importantly, the civil society groups like LUCHA that have grown in response to these failures of the United Nations. But can you speak to an example, perhaps specifically with LUCHA, of how effective these civil society groups are in advocating for change in the DRC, and how that grew out of such suspicions of MONUSCO?
Yes, I think there's two levels to it, right? There's the sort of national level distrust of UN involvement in Congo. That goes back to the 1960s, where the UN was perceived as supporting the Katangan separatists, who were also propped up by the CIA and Belgian intelligence. This was a major crisis that impacted the country in the 1960s, ultimately led to the death of Congo's first prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, and the rise of Mobutu Sese Seko, who became the dictator who ruled Congo for the next 30 years, again with the support of the Western powers, in particular the United States. So I think there, especially amongst the older generations, there is considerable suspicion of outsiders, of the United Nations in particular, for its role in fomenting that crisis and for allowing Mobutu to come to power and essentially destroy much of that country over the next 3 decades. I think with the young people in Eastern Congo, the civil society activists, groups like Lucha in particular, they are of a very different generation. Many of them are, quite young. The founders of Lucha are, only in their 30s, even though the movement has been around for almost 13 years now. So they came of age in a very different era that wasn't particularly motivated by sort of the anti-colonial and post-colonial movements that older Congolese nationalists continue to invoke as justifying their suspicion of external interventions. What they share in common is that many of them, were drawn from kind of the middle classes, from university students based in Goma. They were from Goma originally, so they were born and raised in Eastern Congo. And if you sort of think of the timeline, the first Congolese War began in 1996. That was almost 30 years ago. So for most of these activists who went on to found LUCHA, they've never known anything different, right? Their entire lives have been defined by the war, but also by the international response to the war, right? The UN mission entered Congo in the late 1990s and has been present there ever since. So it's going on, over 25 years operating in Eastern Congo. During that period, they have fundamentally transformed cities like Goma. Goma is one of the most expensive cities in Congo, partially because of the sheer scale of the international presence. You have huge numbers of UN employees who live in Goma, but also all kinds of non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations that are based in Goma. And this has, fundamentally transformed the city. In many ways, it looks like an apartheid city, right, where you have this huge expatriate community. And this is before the M23 invasion, let me be clear. But prior to that, and the last time I was there was in 2023, there were entire parts of the cities that were, defined as almost purely residential for employees of the UN or international NGOs. There were restaurants and bars that solely catered to this vast expatriate community. And I think for young people who grew up in Goma, it's almost impossible not to see the heavily racialized dynamics at play, and the kind of dual economy that emerged around this vast international presence, right? So housing costs, it depends on whether you're an expatriate or a local, but if you're an expatriate, the cost of renting an apartment in Goma can be $2,000 a month. Restaurants will charge you in dollars, at prices that rival what we have here in New York. And so there's a whole kind of cultural divide. And for what? Right. I think that's the real question that many of these young people started asking. What's interesting to me is that it's precisely that group of Congolese, people with often university degrees who may speak French or even English, who were at the forefront of starting LUCHA, right? Because in some ways they probably had a channel to go and work for these non-governmental organizations or the United Nations, but they made the choice not to go that route. Right? I think largely because they were so disenchanted by the sense of what these groups had failed to accomplish after being there for almost a quarter century. And so I think that is kind of very important to understand their cynicism towards both the Congolese state, but also towards the international presence as well. Right? They believe that billions of dollars have been spent, a lot of time has passed, and still there has really been no improvement. And if anything, as the recent success by M23 demonstrates, conditions have actually gotten worse.
I want to turn now to Uganda. Much of the Western media's coverage of this conflict focuses on the DRC, Rwanda, M23, and the United Nations, but Uganda has played a significant role. Can you elaborate on Uganda's involvement and why it's often overlooked?
Yeah, I think it's pretty fascinating that Uganda's involvement in Eastern Congo has managed to stay off the Western radar, at least, because they're not subtle about their involvement in Eastern Congo. To give you some context here, the head of the Ugandan military is the son of the long-standing president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. And he has been present in Eastern Congo. He has been tweeting about his actions in that part of the country. He sends off increasingly deranged messages about his intentions to capture all of these cities in Eastern Congo and to incorporate them into Uganda. And this is all available to anybody with a Twitter account, right? Because he posts multiple times a day about his activities in the East. And he is likely to be the successor to his father, right? So it's not some random figure within the Ugandan government, but literally the head of the military, the son of the president, and the likely future president of the country itself, who is at the forefront of Uganda's involvement in Congo, right? In terms of why it is that Uganda's involvement is not as well known as that of the Rwandans, I think this is an interesting slippage that has occurred really since the the start of the first Congolese War in 1996, because Uganda has always been actively involved in supporting the groups in Eastern Congo. And I would say that, actually during the late 1990s, there was more awareness of how central Uganda was. Uganda and Rwanda are the two longstanding regional military powers in that part of Africa. They are both ruled by ex-rebel leaders, the Yoweri Museveni in Uganda and Paul Kagame in Rwanda. At various points, they have been, very close allies, engaging in joint military actions in Congo as well as elsewhere. But they also, I think the correct term would be frenemies, who kind of vacillate between, periods of working closely together and at times working against each other. Probably the low point of this relationship was in the late 1990s when the two armies, the Rwandan and Ugandan armies, actually fought a war within Congo over the city of Kisangani, leaving it essentially destroyed as a result. So you have this longstanding rivalry, I would say, between the two presidents. And there are slightly different dynamics at work, right? On one side, Rwanda has always framed its involvement in Eastern Congo as being about resolving some of the issues that led to the Rwandan genocide in the first place. Their argument for entering Congo was always tied to the supposed presence of these genocidaires or former genocidaires in Eastern Congo. And so they really tried to provide a kind of legitimating discourse to their decision to intervene in Eastern Congo. Uganda doesn't have the same kind of ready-made excuse for their presence in the East. They have claimed multiple times that they are fighting insurgencies that are based in Eastern Congo. There is some truth to that, but certainly it has been played up in a way that perhaps overstates how powerful these insurgencies are. They've never really posed much of a threat to the Ugandan state, which retains one of the strongest militaries in Africa. And it's clear that, as with the Rwandans, that the primary goal of the Ugandan government has been resource extraction and to increase its military influence in the region, rather than any sort of humanitarian or genuine security interest that the Rwandan state claims is driving their actions. I think that this also raises the question of Rwanda's status, and I was referring to this earlier as a kind of post-genocide state, the way in which a kind of politics of memory is deployed by the Rwandan state to legitimate its actions in Eastern Congo, the willingness of the international community, I think for too long, even though that may be changing now, to grant Rwanda a wide berth, to give it a lot of leeway, to justify its actions that may have been criticized if it was any other government. And so it's a double-sided sword, right? On one side, Rwanda has touted its history of genocide as a kind of way to immunize itself from critiques of its behavior, but it has also generated a lot more attention to its actions. And certainly they have been more integrally involved with the M23 movement in particular. So I think there's a number of factors that explain why Rwanda is more in the crosshairs today than Uganda is currently.
So you mentioned Uganda's economic interests in the region, and I'm interested if you can compare that to what has been reported about how M23 has a history of trafficking minerals from the DRC to Rwanda for sale in Western markets, and what role does mineral extraction and trade play in fueling this conflict? And are there international corporations or economic players, perhaps Uganda, who benefit from the ongoing instability?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and it has I think many different answers. But the shortest answer is the international forces, the logic of global capitalism has always treated Congo as a site of extraction. It is not unique to this current time period, nor is it unique to the eastern part of the country. This is the dynamic that unfolds in many other parts. If you go to the southern part of the country, it is one of the biggest producers of minerals like copper and so on. that also make their way into international markets. And I think, again, historically, this goes back to Congo's centrality within the slave trade. Right? Something like 50% of all the slaves who came to the Western Hemisphere came from two countries in Africa, specifically Congo and Angola, which is its neighbor to the south. So it was a major supplier of human bodies that fueled the slave trade, just as it remains today a major supplier of the minerals that power global capitalism. And so you see this playing out in many different ways. There are all sorts of actors who are involved in the extractive economy of Congo. On the international side, you have big multinational corporations, you have mercenaries, you have all kinds of shady individuals who operate with impunity within Congo across a whole variety of different sectors, including diamonds, gold, timber, coltan, other rare earth minerals. But you also have state actors who are integrally involved in this extractive economy. Rwanda and Uganda have long openly engaged in these sorts of practices. If you go back to the early 2000s, you have multiple reports by the United Nations that show how Rwanda was benefiting from its intervention into Eastern Congo, particularly around gold. In Uganda, there's accusations around timber and charcoal. So there's a whole variety of different things that are coming out of the Congo. Importantly, I think that we also have to extend this line of thinking to the Congolese state itself, right? If you've paid attention to kind of some of the things coming out of Kinshasa over the past few weeks, one of the things that the current president, Tshisekedi, has been doing is trying to woo the American president, Donald Trump, by offering him a minerals deal of the sort that has been floated for Ukraine, wherein the Congolese state would essentially turn over, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of minerals in exchange for American security protection. And I think that, again, speaks to the way in which the entire country has been viewed, both by people within the Congo, but certainly by the international community, as merely a site of extraction. Right. And that extraction has often come at tremendous cost for the Congolese people themselves.
And if we were to predict the next 5 years, what do you see or what do you foresee happening in the DRC in terms of governance, security, or as we were just talking about, international engagement?
Well, I think the safe answer is, much of the same. There's not a lot of pressure on countries like Rwanda and Uganda currently by the international community to rein in their actions in Eastern Congo. So I would suspect that both of them will continue to engage in various types of activities, military, economic, and other, in Eastern Congo for the foreseeable future, but relatively unrestrained. So if anything, you might see it ramping up. I am not convinced that either Rwanda or Uganda will attempt to do a formal annexation of Eastern Congo. That may be just a little too far. But certainly, I think that they're paying attention to what's happening in places like Israel as it, attempts to take territory in places like Syria and Lebanon, and certainly Russia as it tries to take territory in Ukraine, and potentially even the United States if it attempts to take territory in Canada and Greenland. So we're seeing a kind of shifting of global norms around annexation, which once was considered anathema and now increasingly seems to be something that states are considering acceptable and legitimate and not finding much opposition to at the international level. So I think that's the safest bet. If I was going to put on a more optimistic hat, I would look towards civil society as having found a kind of new strategy for action. We talked earlier a little bit about LUCHA. There are other groups like Filimbi that have been active in Congo that are really popular. There was a survey a few years ago that did a survey that did a poll of people across Congo, and it found that LUCHA was the second most popular organization in Congo after the Catholic Church, which was really, really striking for this small group of young people from a relatively peripheral city in the eastern part of the country to have that kind of widespread popularity nationally. I think LUCHA has been pioneering in terms of trying to think through a variety of questions around the limits of their type of social movement activism. And I, tend to believe that what needs to happen in Congo, which remains an extremely young country, the average age of a Congolese person is only in the teens, that these sorts of bottom-up efforts to change are likely to be more successful than any sort of externally driven process, right? And so my probably overly optimistic hope would be that these sorts of popular movements are able to continue generating real support. They are able to continue building a movement that will fundamentally restructure the Congolese state to actually do what it should do, what it should have been doing all along, which is to ensure the welfare of the Congolese people.
Is there a possibility, or do civil society groups like LUCHA have some agency with regard to potential peace within that region?
Well, I guess it depends on what we mean by agency. I would certainly think that they are a key to peace in the region. Like I was saying earlier, I think of LUCHA as a reaction, to the international presence, but also to the Congolese state, and also to the basic presupposition that violence is the only way to bring about political change in Eastern Congo, right? So, if you were a young person in Eastern Congo prior to the rise of LUCHA, you had very few options if you wanted to try to make change in that part of the country, right? Maybe you could go into the government, but the government has never been particularly effective and is often quite corrupt. As we already have discussed, the UN presence and the international non-governmental organizations are generally viewed as ineffective. And there's also been this, third option of violent organizations. There are a lot of militant movements that operate in Eastern Congo, not just M23, but many others, ranging from very small civilian defense forces to much more organized groups. You also have mercenaries who are present in the region. And young people, have often been the pool from which these groups draw their supporters from. And I think the rise of LUCHA shows that young people were frustrated with all of these options, right? And have been trying to develop a different kind of model that can engage in political work without resorting to violence, without being kind of caught up in the corruption of the Congolese state, without having to the kind of pathologies of the international intervention, and really trying to think through what does it mean for a government to actually respond to the will of the people, right? And I think that's why I have some optimism, because I think that's really the only route forward. Unfortunately, I don't think the international community has quite recognized the importance of building up what we could call grassroots peace builders. They are not invited to these peace talks. If you want to be a part of peace talks in Congo going back to the 96, 98 wars, the way to do that was to mount a rebellion, right? The 98 peace agreement, for example, is a perfect example, where you had the Congolese government only negotiating with the armed groups, right? Not with civil society, not with social movements, but only with the armed groups. And so what is the lesson you take from that? It's, well, if you want to have a seat at the table, as it were, the only way to do that is through violence. And I think that's a dynamic that the international community continues to reinforce, and one that will continue to relegate Congo as kind of the spoils of a military victory, right? Rather than an actual country with something like a social contract that ensures that the state works to meet the needs of its population, as we might imagine is the ideal.
Is there an under-discussed issue regarding this conflict that you think deserves more attention?
I think that, if we were to think about Congo, right, it is overwhelming. And there is a way in which, precisely because it is such a complex conflict, such a vast country, so many different actors involved, it can feel, quite impenetrable, right? Quite impossible to understand. And I think that has led to Congo historically and into the current day always being the site where we project onto it, all kinds of really nightmares, right? That have very little basis in reality. This goes back, of course, to Joseph Conrad and the Heart of Darkness. But that type of thinking, right, the idea that there's something about Congo, right, that there is a way in which Congo is just sort of destined to always be this heart of darkness, this open sore in the heart of Africa, right? All this kind of language that people use to talk about what's happening can be very problematic, and this is something that is true whether it's done by overtly racist people, but also I think like liberals who mean well, right, by depicting it in a particular way. I think that what I would say is that if we acknowledge that Congo is the size of Western Europe, then we should recognize that it has the same sort of complexity as Western Europe. Right? There are just huge numbers of people. There are many different cities. There are parts of the country that have been very peaceful, that remain at peace to this day. And there are others that we tend to focus on that have been characterized by this chronic violence. Right? So I think that flattening it, viewing it as this sort of unbroken, multiple centuries long site for human deprivation is actually counterproductive. Right? It prevents us from seeing all of the amazing things that Congo and I think the Congolese in particular have accomplished, continue to accomplish, and will accomplish in the future. In ways that I think are ultimately, fueling the idea that it is beyond salvation, right? And I think paying more attention to what's happening beyond the cliches, beyond the idea that it's just this site of extraction, this site of violence, is something that we all need to be doing, right? Because Congo is a hugely important country. It is not just caught up in the past. It is very much a part of our future. In some ways, it is the cutting edge. And I think that if we want to understand anything that's happening at the global level, right, especially when we're talking about technology or the evolution of humanitarian norms, so on and so forth, we can only do that by paying attention to what's happening in Congo. And so I would encourage far more attention outside of these moments of spectacular crises. To really appreciate, what the Congo is and how it has found itself at the forefront of so many of these issues.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Zachariah Mampilly. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.